Good morning, everyone. We are continuing our study in the book of Judges, and we're going to talk about Samson this morning. And since it is a very, not only a massive amount of material, because it's just so dense, there's so many things that happen in Samson's life, but because it's such a unique sort of material, I'm going to have to do the class a little bit differently. And I apologize if it might feel a little bit more like a lecture than a back and forth, but I will certainly try to open up for comments and questions. It's just, you'll see why the style has to be a little different. It'll make sense to you. Where's my clicker? There it is. Before we get started, though, let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you for another day of worship that you've given us. Thank you for your word, and as we study it this morning, help it to change us, to transform our lives. Help us to learn lessons from Samson that will help us draw closer to you and avoid many of the sins and pitfalls that he committed in sinning against you, and help us not to do those things, and help us to learn from the good example of him turning to you in the end and trusting in your strength. Strengthen us as we study this morning. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm first going to just tell the story of Samson, and then we will discuss it in terms of its overall purpose in the narrative. So in chapter 13, an angel appears to Samson's parents in the city of Zorah. You can see Zorah there in the tribe of Dan, and a lot of this account is going to involve that general geographic area of Zorah, and then he's going to meet the woman in Timnah, and then he's going to be dealing with the Philistines. These are going to be the primary enemies, and he's going to have dealings in Gaza and Ashkelon. And what we see is, in chapter 13, an angel appears to Samson's parents and promises that a child will be born that would begin to deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. But this would be no ordinary child. This child would have a special, holy relationship with God as a Nazirite. And who remembers the three restrictions on a Nazirite, basically?
Don't cut your hair.
Okay, don't cut your hair. Yeah, okay, don't be involved with grapes of any kind, pretty much. Grape juice, wine, whatever. And then what was the third one that you guys had?
Don't touch a dead body.
Yeah, don't touch any dead body. Nothing unclean. Okay? However, in chapter 14, as we talk about Samson's story in more depth, we see that he doesn't seem very holy at all. He sees a woman of Timnah, a daughter of the Philistines, and he tells his parents that he really wants her. Why does he want her? Is it because she has a really good heart? No, she looks good to me. This is what he says. She's very attractive, and I want her. I must have her. And instead of being holy, he wants to marry this woman who serves foreign gods. And on his way down to meet her, a lion attacks him. And you see the raw strength that God gives him. When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he tears this lion almost like a sheet of paper. And later he even eats honey from the carcass of the lion, which is a blatant violation of his Nazirite vow, to avoid things that are dead. Not only does he touch a dead animal, he goes inside of this lion with his hand and eats from it. Then he spreads that defilement to his parents. Even normal Jews who weren't under a Nazirite vow would not be scraping honey out of a lion, and yet he even more so should be avoiding that. And then he seems to violate his vow again, or at least come close to it, by throwing a drinking party for his bride to be. The word feast in chapter 14 there is going to be a word that means drinking party, and his bride-to-be is there, and they invite 30 Philistine companions. We can't prove that he was drinking at this party, but I do not doubt it. In fact, in verse 5, it makes a note about him being near a vineyard. I think that's a textual hint that Solomon really didn't take seriously this idea that I needed to stay away from grapes. And at this feast, he tells a riddle to the Philistines, and he places a bet with them. He says, if you get the riddle right, I'll give you 30 changes of clothes. And these would be fancy garments. These would be like suits, It wasn't just a t-shirt or something like that. These were fancy garments that he was going to give them. And he says, but if you get it wrong, then you all have to give me 30 changes of clothes. And how did they figure out the riddle? Yeah, so they got his wife to tell, or his future wife, his bride-to-be. How did they do that, though? Yeah, they threatened to kill her, to murder her and her father if she didn't find that out and tell them the answer. So she she annoys Samson to death. She cries every day, and please tell me if you really love me, you'd tell me the answer to this. And of course, Samson, he's weak when it comes to women, and he just does whatever they want apparently eventually. And so he says, okay, I'll tell you the riddle. She tells the Philistines, they get the riddle right, and Samson is furious. And he calls his bride to be a heifer. And he storms out in a rage, and he goes and he goes down to Ashkelon, and he kills 30 of basically their own countrymen, and takes the 30 changes of clothes from them and gives them to them. Instead of giving the changes of clothes from himself, he kills their countrymen, takes it, and gives it to them. And apparently, after calling his bride a heifer and storming out in anger, her father thought, well, Samson doesn't want anything to do with her anymore, so he gives her to someone else to marry. So in chapter 15, Samson shows up to her door with a box of chocolate under his arm. Well, it was a young goat, but it's the same kind of idea. Hair slicked over, and he wants to basically make this wedding happen. She's my bride. I'm here to take her. And her father says, sorry, I gave her to someone else. I thought you hated her. Now Samson is really mad at the Philistines. Now he really blames them, because if it wasn't for all this riddle stuff, his wife would have never been given to someone else. And now he's really mad, so he takes 300 foxes, and he ties torches between their tails. I used to think he tied their tails together. I don't really think that's what the text means or even says that. I think it's just he took torches, and maybe with a rope he probably tied them between. I'm not sure even anatomically if you're able to tie a fox's tail together, just because the way, the tail will probably break and it'd be kind of loose, and maybe that's how it happened. I don't know, but if you had that in your mind that he definitely tied the tails together like I did, well, I don't think that's necessarily what happened. But anyway,
Brian, are you saying he ties the tails together with rope?
Yes, and a torch in between. Yes.
Okay.
I used to think I don't know where I got that from. Like that he took a torch and then he took their tails and kind of intertwined them, because he has super strength, So I thought, well, he's got super strength, he can tie their tails together. But then I was like, yeah, but a tail's not really designed that way. Anyway, so I digress. The point of tying the torch to the foxes was to then let the foxes loose. And the foxes run with these torches, and it destroys all the Philistine crops. And what do they do in response? They go and murder his bride. The very thing they threatened to do earlier. They follow through. They kill her and her father. And now Samson is really mad. And then he goes and slaughters them. And eventually, the tribe of Judah gets involved, because they see that Samson is really causing problems for them, because he's rocking the boat with the Philistines. And they're afraid of the Philistines, so the tribe of Judah comes to hand Samson over to the Philistines. And so they bind him, and they think that he's bound, but they're wrong. He breaks free, and then he slaughters 1,000 Philistines with what? Yeah, the jawbone of a donkey. And then in chapter 16, it seems like deja vu. Samson goes to a harlot, and it puts him in a dangerous position again. But he escapes, and he breaks the city gate off, and he carries it with great strength up through a mountain. And then again, he sees another woman he should not be with, Delilah, and she betrays him to the Philistines for money. They play this game where she asks him what the secret of his strength is, and he tells her, but it's not the right answer. So the Philistines come to attack him, but it doesn't work, and Samson destroys them, and then she's mad at him. And again, it's the same thing over and over again. If you really loved me, you would tell me the secret of your strength. Why do you keep lying to me, Samson? What's going on? And I think he's just toying with her, because he's arrogant, and he trusts in his own strength. So eventually, because she annoys him to death again, he tells her about the hair. And because the hair was so crucial to keeping the Nazirite vow, once she cuts his hair, God is no longer with him. And now he has no strength left. You can imagine. Samson, great strength. And now all of a sudden, I'm sure he just expected, hey, I'm going to use my strength just like always. And then, wait, I'm just a normal man. I don't have my strength anymore. The enemies capture him. They put out his eyes. They humiliate him. They force him to work as a slave on a grinding mill. And essentially, they humiliate him, and they mock him, and they even mock God. And yet at the end of his life, he turns to God. He asks for strength to defeat the Philistines. And God restores his strength and gives him victory in the end, even though it cost him his life in the process. So that's the story, 13 to 16 of Samson. But I understand this account, when you're a child, is just so awesome. It's probably one of our favorites, especially young boys, because he just has super strength, and it's just so entertaining what happens. But then when you get older and you start to really think through this text, you become a little disturbed. It becomes pretty puzzling. Because you realize, as a kid, maybe you thought Samson was a great hero, but then you start to read as an adult, and you're like, it doesn't really sound very heroic. It sounds very sinful. He really is lustful. He's impulsive. He doesn't take his Nazirite vow seriously. And did you notice that even when he does attack the Philistines, many times it just seems like it's all about personal revenge. It's not really for the Lord, per se. And so it may be confusing why God would use a man like this to accomplish his purpose. And we're going to talk about that, what may be going on in the overall picture here as we go through this class. But are there any questions about just the story of what happens before we get into maybe some big picture things? Bill?
Samson, there are many lessons that men can that way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Confinement is the same.
Yeah, we learn a lot of lessons from Samson about, how not to behave, how not to act. And again, sometimes that's confusing for us because we think the judges are supposed to be these righteous people. Not necessarily. So let me help us see what's going on. Why would he use Samson, a man like Samson, to be a judge? First of all, Samson's story is Israel's story. God uses Samson because he is a microcosm of the nation of Israel as a whole. And I want to spend some time pointing out those parallels because they contain a lot of great lessons for us. First of all, both were chosen by God before birth. You notice in the book of Judges, Samson is unique because his birth narrative is recorded. There is no other judge whose birth narrative like that is recorded. And it shows that God had special plans for Samson, just like God had special plans for Israel. Secondly, both were chosen for a special, holy relationship with God. Samson was meant to be a Nazirite for life, totally set apart, totally dedicated to God forever. You remember what God told his people at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6? What did he tell them basically at their birth, at the birth of themselves as a nation in Exodus 19? You remember? Yeah, they were God's people. He says in Exodus 19, 5 and 6, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So both Israel and Samson were supposed to be holy, set apart, special in relationship with God. Also, both came through miraculous births. Samson's mother was barren, and she wasn't supposed to be able to have a child, but God blessed her anyway. How about Israel's mother? She was barren too, Rebekah. She was barren, and yet God blessed her as well. And the point of that is that this child is special and appointed for a special purpose and for a special relationship that others do not have. Also, both were given miraculous victory over their enemies. The Spirit of the Lord coming upon Samson was the supernatural endowment of God's strength on him so that he could accomplish miraculous feats like tearing a lion in half and killing thousands of men with the jawbone of a donkey, or lifting a giant gate off of a city gate. And likewise, look at all the miraculous victories God gave Israel by his Spirit over the Egyptians, over the Amalekites, over Sihon and Og, over the Canaanites once they came there in Joshua. Both faithlessly cried out for water, and God provides. Look in Judges 15. In Judges 15, verses 18 and 19. See if this sounds familiar to you. Judges 15, verses 18 and 19. This is right after God gave him great victory over his enemies with the jawbone. Verse 18, then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi so that water came out of it. And when he drank, his strength returned, and he revived. And then he gave the place a new name. That sound familiar? Yeah. As soon as they had victory over the Egyptians, now they're in the wilderness. And what do they say? You bring us out here in the wilderness to die? And then God gives them water out of the hollow of a rock.
But he gave them the manna first, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. He gave them manna as well.
First, and then the rock, and that caused a leader lots of trouble.
Yeah.
Because he was told to go to the rock.
Yeah.
And he hit it with his staff. And
Yes, exactly. So, but you see those parallels. And then also, both abandon God and go their own way. Look at something interesting in Judges 14. Judges 14, verse 3. Verse 3. Judges 14, verse 3. Then his father and his mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she looks good to me. Now, if you drop down to verse 7, that same phrase is used. Verse 7, so he went down and talked to the woman, for she looked good to Samson. Does anybody have a footnote on that verse next to the phrase, looked good to Samson? Anybody have a footnote in their Bibles? Okay. Whoever has the New American Standard does.
Looks good in his eyes.
Yes. The phrase literally in Hebrew is, she is right in my eyes. Look at the very last verse of Judges. The very last verse of Judges. Judges 21, verse 25. It's a summary of the period of the judges for the Israelites. And it says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Same Hebrew phrase as in Judges 14, describing Samson. Now look in Judges 2 in verse 17. Judges 2 in verse 17. Judges 2 in verse 17. Again, a summary of the period of the Israelites. Verse 17, yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked, in obeying the commands of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. Notice that the phrase for going after other gods is playing the harlot. What was Samson obsessed with? Harlots. Women that he had no... One of them was a harlot. Maybe the others weren't harlots per se, but from a perspective of them being foreign women that he had no right to be with, he too was obsessed. Just like the Israelites, who were all doing what was right in their own eyes and obsessed with harloting themselves out to Baal. Samson also polluted his holiness. He ate from the unclean lion. He participated in a drinking festival. He allowed a woman to seduce him into cutting his hair. And Israel too was defiled with the uncleanness of the land around them and was seduced by the sexual immorality of the pagan lifestyle. In fact, you remember I said it was like deja vu in chapter 16, where now Samson finds another woman. You know, first Samson finds a woman he's not supposed to be with, causes all kinds of problems, all kinds of suffering, all kinds of affliction. And then again, in chapter 16, he finds another woman, causes him another source of suffering and affliction, and then he finds another woman, Delilah, and then that's all suffering and affliction as well. That's a reflection of the sin cycle of Israel that we've seen repeated all throughout this book so far. Both are abandoned by God and given over to their enemies. Samson isn't just a picture of Israel up to this point. He's a prophecy of what will happen to Israel eventually. You see, Samson thought he could just keep treating this Nazirite vow lightly forever. He could just keep repeating this cycle of sin and there would never be any real consequence. Look in Judges 16 again. Judges 16 and verse 20. Really want you to notice and pick up on this. In Judges 16 verse 20, after he finally told her about the hair, cutting of the hair, verse 20, she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he woke up from his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. You see, to Samson, this was just a game with Delilah. Even when he told her about cutting off the hair, he didn't really think that was going to do anything. And he thought, well, God will just deliver me like he always has. Almost taking for granted this fact that God has been delivering him from his enemies. But now that he's gone this far, God isn't with him anymore. And Samson's hauled off into captivity and humiliated by his enemies. His enemies not only mocked Samson, but they mocked God. And they praised their God, Dagon, as being stronger than Yahweh. And all of this is exactly what's going to happen to the Israelites later in their history. They're going to continue like Samson to repeat this sin cycle. And eventually, God is going to say, that's enough. They're going to be taken captive by their enemies. They're going to be mocked and humiliated. Yahweh himself is going to be mocked by their enemies. And they're going to be praising their own gods as being stronger than Yahweh. But we also see that both are restored and given victory. Captivity and humiliation was not the end for Samson. I think Samson was humbled. He was very arrogant, probably for 90% of the story. And then at the very end, he was humbled to realize that all the strength that he's had wasn't his own. It was coming from the Spirit of the Lord. And without God, he had no strength. He was nothing. And so hang on one second, Mike. And so he realized that he needs to turn to God and beg him for strength again. Look in Judges 16 in verse 22. It says, "However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off." I don't think this is just a commentary about hair. I think the point is he rededicated himself to his Nazirite vow after he had been humiliated and humbled. And notice what he says in verse 30. Verse 30. Samson said to God, "Let me die with the Philistines." He almost seems to recognize that he deserves to die with the Philistines because he's been living like a Philistine in his sinful arrogance. Yet in humble repentance, he turns back to God, and God gives him victory over his enemies. And that's exactly what will happen to the Israelites later in their history. Yes, they'll be taken into captivity, but once they humble themselves and realize, I'm nothing without God, I need to come back to him. And they do. And they don't really have much victory in the land when they come back, but the ultimate victory they have is through Jesus Christ, the spiritual victory, when the Messiah is sent and they have victory over Satan and his demons. Mike, do you have something?
Yeah, 14:4. It looks like God, it says God is at work.
Okay, yes.
In the beginning, but I guess he involved.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna make a comment about that in a little bit. Yeah, good point. I'll bring that up a little bit later. Herb?
I think this is the Father coming out in me. Because I think I heard my dad say this. You have to take things sometimes seriously. We're not being serious. Our commitments to things. He didn't take his commitments to God seriously.
No.
It was very casual.
Yeah.
One minute he's wanting help, and the next he's doing whatever he wants to do. It's just a real sad relationship that he thought he should have with God.
I agree.
And I'm not saying we're all guilty of the same thing.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, that's probably I'm saying some of myself in this.
Good. Yeah.
Not being serious.
Yeah.
About certain.
And that's what we should do. We need to look for ourselves in these accounts. And what Herb says is absolutely right. Samson was very casual about his relationship with God. He was very flippant about it. I can just do whatever I want, and then, hey, I'm strong enough to get out of it, and then I'll just go slaughter you if you get on my bad side. It was just a terrible attitude. And listen, whatever God has set up as a lesson for for the Israelites is a lesson for us. Because we are the new Israel. We are the spiritual Israelites. And we learn these same lessons. These things all apply to us. God has chosen us before the foundation of the world to be His special people, a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. 1 Peter 2, Ephesians chapter 1. He gives us miraculous victory over our enemies in Jesus Christ. We have no power on our own to defeat Satan, yet because of what Christ did and His power in us, and the Spirit of the Lord in us, we can defeat even the strongest of enemies. But we must not treat God's gifts and blessings lightly. We must not be casual about what God has done for us. We must take our relationship very seriously. Otherwise, He will give us over to our enemies. In fact, that phrase is used in Romans 1. He gave them over. He'll give us over and we'll become a laughingstock. But if we trust in Him for strength, we'll have victory in the end. And I'll tell you, Samson was not a perfect man by any stretch. But he turned things around in the end. So if we find that maybe we're living like Samson right now, there is hope if we'll change. Come back to the Lord. And Samson's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. I think that's what bothers us so much. How in the world is Samson in Hebrews 11? That doesn't fit. Well, it's because he turned it around in the end. Jason.
I think one of the things we can understand too is Samson, the bulk of his life he called it arrogance, but it wasn't just arrogance. It was all about his own glory, all about his own need. It was never about God. So when you get to the end there, and I think this is the attitude that we can take away that we need to have in our relationship with God. He wanted vengeance on the Philistines. He wanted victory, but he wasn't asking God to bail him out of trouble this time. That's why he said, "Let me die." I'm not asking you for water so I don't die in the desert. I'm not asking you for strength so I can look like I'm the best. Let me glorify you this one last time. And I understand that the gift you have given me was for your glory, not mine. Let me die with these people. But let me exercise your will.
Yeah, really good thought.
And that is a completely different attitude, as you say, that he expressed for the rest of his life. I think he finally understood that God was not there to be at his beck and call. He was the servant to God.
Yeah.
And that's why he was not concerned about saving his own life.
Yeah,
he was concerned about his God.
Great point.
For the first time in his
A
life.
total shift in the way he treated God and viewed God. Joe? And then Brent.
Another similarity was when his eyes were poked out, when they were gouged out, he couldn't see. And the last king, just before Israel went into captivity, the king was poked out.
Yeah, was it Zedekiah?
Zedekiah.
Yeah, King Zedekiah. Good point.
And so there's some similarities there. And I think sometimes for us, application, like you're saying, this is not written for them, it's written for us. It's only when we're blind that we can see through faith.
Good point.
We just cannot, our eyes don't tell us everything.
Yeah.
We have to know God.
Absolutely. Jesus makes that very point in John chapter 9 to the Pharisees. He says, you know why you can't see? He says, because you don't think you're blind. You don't admit your own spiritual blindness. That's why you can't see. And then they were criticizing a blind man that Jesus healed and gave sight. And yeah, that's a really powerful point. Many times we don't see clearly until our strength, our own sight, and the way we've been looking at things is totally transformed and changed. Brenda and then her.
I'm really glad you laid this out this way because I've been stressed for days reading this.
Yeah.
Because
I hear you.
I kept breaking them up into separate pieces because it kept reminding me of different people through the Bible. Is this a symbol? David had his relationship with Bathsheba, and I'm comparing that. And then when he's with the Philistines, I was thinking of the kings who were involved in idol worship and how it brought down the kings. And then he just mentioned Zedekiah. I was like, oh, that's the one. So I was trying to put together what does this mean, and and I thought, am I missing that Jesus is in here? So I was really stressed.
Yeah.
So I'm appreciative, but also de-stressed because this, once again, God comes through and teaches, sets your path straight, sets your mind at ease about, I'm in control and look what I'm doing. Yeah. And he can shepherd us the same way that he saw this coming and happening. So it's
absolutely
helpful.
Yeah, God is really, really amazing and remarkable how how he puts these things in his word. Or,
Maybe this is what you meant, but when Joe pointed out about the blindness, it's just the irony of him saying she looks good to me in my own eyes, and what the scripture read about men doing what's right in their own eyes. And like Joe said, the irony of God pointing that out and his eyes being taken away from him, and he can see better.
great point. Yeah, look where Samson's eyes got him.
Yeah.
Because that's all he really operated on, was what I can see. It was a very fleshly mindset. And I loved teaching Samson to the high schoolers when I did this a while ago, because honestly, teenage boys especially need to learn the lesson from Samson, that you do not chase after a girl simply because she looks good. And yet that's what our culture teaches, that looks are all that's important. And women, by the way, that's not where your sense of value should come from either. Just your looks and thinking, well, if I want to attract a man, well, I need to do everything I can to look good and change my clothing and my makeup and all that stuff. The problem is when you do that, you're going to attract a man like Samson. And you don't want to do that. And men, you don't want to be Samson. It's a disaster. It's just it doesn't mean that you can't be physically attracted to your girlfriend or your wife or whatever. That's a part of the equation, but there's nothing said about her heart or her character. She's like Samson didn't say she's like the Proverbs 31 woman. No, it was just she's fine. She just looks good, and that's it. That was his measure of should I be with her. Nothing to do with God's law and what God wanted from him. So tons of lessons in this account for us. Let me make another point, another big picture observation. And I haven't forgotten about your point. We'll get there, Mike.
One more quick point.
Okay.
We use Lot and we use Samson. We really trash these guys with good cause.
Okay.
But Peter says Lot is righteous and Samson is in Hebrews 11. So it's kind of
Well, that's true. So our problem is, there is hope, exactly. It's hard to know sometimes if we see that Samson's in Hebrews 11, then we try to figure out how can he be in 11 because look at all these horrible things he did. Well, when you understand the flow of the narrative, it's because he changed in the end. So yeah, there is hope for all of us. Let me point this out too. Samson's story is a mockery of God's enemies. Remember Psalm 2 and verse 4, that really in the context is this idea that God's enemies have surrounded him, and they're going to stop God from accomplishing his purposes and fight against his son. And it says, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Just like the Ehud story, this is a mockery of the Philistines. There are a lot of things in this account that make the Philistines look really dumb. And that's on purpose. Because it's to show just how powerful God is over his enemies. Yes, they were a scary force that afflicted his people for 40 years. But when God got involved, they were a joke. They were nothing. Think about several things along this line. This is unique in Judges. Samson was a one-man army. If we thought God was bold for reducing that, 20,000 person army down to 300 with Gideon, he doesn't need 300. Samson just does it all by himself. God doesn't need an army. And this makes the Philistines look so weak because they can't even stop one guy. You can imagine the meetings, the business meetings that we're having. What is going on with Samson? And we can't seem to do anything about this guy. How is he killing us? What is his secret? One guy giving him problems. They can't figure out Samson's riddle. They're so dumb they have to threaten his bride-to-be to tell him the point. Now, I think it was a hard riddle, but I think the point is they're just not very bright or intelligent, and kind of connected to that, they took clothing from their own people. The text doesn't even tell us they realized what happened, but when Samson killed their own people and took their clothes and gave it to them, they probably just accepted it and like, oh, well, great, we got our clothes now. Didn't realize what happened, that Samson totally duped them and totally just, killed their own people for it. Samson used foxes to burn their crop. I just think that's a funny, humorous illustration of how easy it is for Samson to destroy them. I'll just get some foxes. I don't need big war horses, and I don't need, a tank or a tower. I just need some, just give me some foxes and I'll let them loose and destroy your whole life. So it's just incredible how God uses Samson to do this so easily. They think, this happens a lot. They think Samson is bound, but they're wrong. Happened a lot of times. You think about when Judah hands them over, and And they're like, yes, we got him now. He's bound. And then he breaks free and he kills 1,000 under the jawbone of a donkey. You think about when he's in the house with the harlot in Gaza and they surround the city and they're like, we got him now. He's trapped. There's no way out. And he just escapes at night, picks the city gate up and just walks off with it. And then the 3 times, or I guess it's another 2 times, it happens, maybe it's 2 or 3, I can't remember the count. But anyway, with Delilah, where every time the Philistines think they've got him, he just breaks free and destroys them. It's just a mockery on them. And the final joke is on them. At the end, when they finally think they have victory over Samson, they bring him in and think about this, they foolishly chain him up between a couple pillars that were foundational to the structure of the house. And as they're mocking him and being entertained by him, he brings the whole house down and kills them. So it's almost like they killed themselves by their own arrogance. And of course, that all happened right after they praised Dagon for their great victory. And so it's a mockery not only of the Philistines, but of their false god, Dagon, as well. And despite their mockery of Samson and Yahweh, Yahweh is glorified in the end. And here's where I'm getting to Mike's point. God planned this from the beginning. Judges 14:4. Judges 14:4. Judges 14:4. Even when Samson was making a foolish, sinful choice, it still says in verse 4, however, his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. So it's not that God condoned his sin. It's that God used his sinful choice as a means to gain victory over the Philistines. So it's not like God was caught off guard by the Philistines and all that they did. God raised Samson up from birth for the very purpose of humiliating, embarrassing, and destroying his enemies. And of course, he began to destroy the Philistines. The Philistines will still give them some problems in the future. But Samson just makes an utter mockery of his enemies. And the same is true today. That Satan and his demons are our enemies, but they're just a joke to God. So be on God's side and you'll have power over them. And all the people in the world who think they're very smart and intelligent and the Christians are the stupid ones and science is the real God, just wait. Just wait. Because in the end, God's going to reverse all of that. And they're going to be the ones that are mocked and judged and embarrassed and humiliated. And I'm not saying that with any sort of pleasure. Obviously, we don't want anybody to be lost. But I'm saying, get on God's side. Don't be an enemy of God. You will be humiliated. Questions or comments on that? Randy?
Yeah, to the degree that I have pride in my life, there is not room for the Holy Spirit. And God has missions and special things he needs us to do. And when pride is there, some of those things don't get done. But just like the walls of Jericho, he can bring that wall of pride down by humbleness.
Absolutely.
We see that.
Yeah. Samson was brought low in his pride, and the Philistines were brought low in their pride. And that's a pattern all throughout Scripture. So as soon as you get self-reliant and prideful, pride goeth before the fall. I think it was Matt and then her.
Just kind of expanding on that, just some kind of related points is, his life is a mess. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And to expand on what we said, God is doing that, I think, in a lot of times in our lives. Not always, but if you feel like your life is a mess, maybe God's trying to tell you, like, you're not relying on him enough. And sometimes he has to break us down in ourselves. Yeah. So we realize ourselves is not working and we have to rely on God.
Yeah, definitely.
But then related to that also is if you do feel like your life is a mess, sometimes we can get depressed and down and think I'm too far gone, I've sinned too much, whatever it is, No. God will take you back if you come back. You're never too far gone.
Yes, great point. Yeah, you're never too far gone as long as there's time left on the earth, as long as God gives us time.
Push it off.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't mean put it off. Return to the Lord, and there's hope for you. And yeah, it seems like Samson had to hit rock bottom, but look how far down rock bottom was for him. His bride-to-be and her father was murdered, and that wasn't even rock bottom for him. He still had to lose much more than that in order to be awakened to the truth.
three quick thoughts.
Okay.
Is it possible the problem we're having here, seeing this faithless Samson being used to punish the Philistines, is there some irony here that he uses faithless Persia and Babylon to punish the Israelites? Is it possible that that's, you think,
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, God does have a pattern, it seems.
Yeah.
When his people are not holy, he'll use a faithless nation to punish them. Yeah.
Okay,
And
so-
maybe Samson is a commentary on he's the best one God could find in
Yeah.
Israel at the time. It's pretty sad.
do you think he really was made to dance?
Oh,
What's
yeah,
your thoughts about that?
I don't have any thoughts about the specific way that he was entertaining them. Was he dancing? Was he singing? I don't know how they were entertained by Samson. Yeah.
And how much time do you think passed between the time they gouged out his eyes and took him captive to the time he pushed the pillar?
That I don't know. I mean, his hair would have to grow back out to some level,
In some
but
of
I
the
don't know.
classes that I taught, the books, it seems to be like 10 years, or 15 years, or 20
Oh,
years.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that because there's not that much time left.
Right, the hair grows at a rate of 1/52nd of an inch every year.
I knew you'd have that answer, Jack. Great. That's awesome. You read that in an article like many years ago, right? You still remembered it. Steel trap. Yeah, so however long it took for the hair to grow out, I'm not sure. Hey, let me make sure. I have to get through this last section because I want to just, blow your minds even more with the way. I want God to blow your mind essentially with the brilliance of His Word. Because Samson's story also foreshadows Jesus' story. Obviously, Jesus cannot be compared to Samson morally because Jesus was perfect. Samson was very, very immoral for a lot of his life, but there are tons of parallels between Samson and Jesus. First of all, both had a miraculous birth. Second, both were born to be deliverers. In fact, at his birth, it was announced, he will be born to begin to deliver the Philistines from her hands. And at Jesus' birth in Matthew 1:21, he'll be born essentially to save the people from their sins. Also, they were both sent by God without being asked. This is interesting because Samson's account is unique because there's no crying out in this sequence. It just says they're afflicted, and then it goes immediately into Samson's birth. So they didn't actually, unless it happened and the text just doesn't tell us, but they didn't actually cry out to God for deliverance. God just raised Samson up anyway, without them asking, without them even repenting and turning to Him. Likewise, in Jesus' day, it's not like the people were crying out, save us from our sins, but God raised up a deliverer to do that for them anyway, even without them asking. Both were just one-man armies, dominating their enemies by the Spirit of the Lord. Samson was tearing lions. Jesus was tearing Satan, the lion who roams about seeking whom he may devour. Both confounded their enemies with riddles and parables. Think of all the times Jesus asked his enemies a question, and they couldn't answer. They could not figure it out, and so they tried to kill him instead. Both were handed over to their Gentile enemies by their own people. Look in Judges 15:11 again. Judges 15:11. Sorry, I'm going fast to this. Judges 15:11. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." The people of Judah started off so strong in chapter 1, but now they're cowards who think that Samson is going to mess things up and make things worse for them with the Philistines. And guess what? This sounds exactly like the Pharisees in John 11:48, who said that, "Jesus, you're messing things up for us. The Romans are going to come and take away our place." They didn't want Jesus rocking the boat, and so they plotted to kill him. Both were mocked and humiliated by their enemies. Both were sold into their enemies' hands with silver, or for silver. Both cried out to God in their final hour. Both conquered their enemies by dying. And it says in Judges 16:30 that Samson killed more in his death than he did in his life. Likewise, Jesus accomplished more in his death, even than he did by his life. The final joke is on Satan, because Satan thought he was defeating Jesus by putting him on a cross, but it was just like putting him right next to the foundations of the house. And Jesus on the cross actually tore Satan's house down on him in his death. He crushed all his enemies, and God planned this from the beginning. Genesis 3:15, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will crush you on the head, shall crush him on the heel. Comments or questions? That's all I've got on Samson. But be impressed with God and the power of his word to put all these marvelous lessons there for us to learn. Please read through the beginning of page 109 of your book, and that is all our time. We've got 3 more seconds before the bell. Thank you all so much.